So, as Jonah noted, I am Kelsey Boyd. I am Atten's digital strategist. So for us, that typically means that I'm really involved in the front end of projects, facilitating research with stakeholder groups, as well as users directly, and building on the data that we'll be looking at today to really kind of give ourselves the really impact-driven goals and user needs that will drive the project. And then I work really closely with our design and development teams to ensure that all the feedback that we get from our clients finds its way into the way that we organize and structure content across the site.
Hey, Kelsey, real quick, can you make your screen full size?
Potentially.
Can-
Yeah, I'm doing this. Let's see. You'll have to let me know if this actually works. How's that look?
Yes. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So as Jenna mentioned, we're a strategy, design, and development firm. So for us, that really means that there's different perspectives we're bringing to our analytics approach. So for me, in the strategy phase, I'm really focused on kind of the initial look at what types of data that we are looking at and getting into clients' content. And actually, Jenna, I noticed that when I did this, I lost my speaker notes. So I might actually have to do it a little bit different. Give me one moment. There's an interview. Oh my gosh. Not full screen, really. That was a full screen. Sorry about that delay. Okay. So yeah, we're gonna have to go. You'll see a little bit of my browser, but you guys can work with that. Okay. So
That's
yeah,
perfect.
okay, thanks. Yeah, so for us, with strategy, my focus is again kind of really on the types of data that we're going to be leveraging with analytics. I work a lot with clients to jump into those existing analytics and really understand how people are engaging with content on their site, and as well as identifying kind of ways that they can measure success in the future based on the goals and kind of user needs that we identify early in strategy. From there, I work closely with our design team to ensure that those key interactions and ways that we're going to drive and measure success are clearly designed in a way that kind of guides users to engage with those actions. But lastly, the development team is really the ones responsible for implementing that tracking. And I work really closely with them to configure the analytics, again, to track those measurements that we determined early on. But in general, today, again, it's really going to be focused on the types of user data that you can find across analytics tools. But if you're interested in learning more from kind of an implementation perspective, I would really recommend taking a look at a recent blog post from our VP Engineering, Jill Steidel, that talks about the transition from UA to GA4. So just to jump into a little bit of what we're going to be covering today. So we'll be looking at types of data and data sources, what you can learn across analytics tools, what you can't learn from analytics, and how we would recommend to kind of supplement the information and data that you can find there. So starting with the types of data and data sources. So we'll be start by talking about what kinds of user data we typically use at Atten and what might be something your team can independently leverage to support decision-making. So we really want to make sure that you kind of leave today with the ability to feel like you have ownership of your data and that this isn't as vague as it can really seem. So just at a high level, something that I'm often hearing is not as clear as I would like it to be is kind of the two major types of data that we gather with our research engagements in UX. So those are quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative really is measured in numbers. It's where you can really count numerically what people are doing. Qualitative is measured in a lot of different ways, but we can talk about it through the idea of experience quality. So really understanding kind of why people are doing what they're doing, having a conversation with them, having more open feedback and getting words behind some of those numbers. So this is our kind of rule of thumb that we use is quantitative is really any kind of input that's over 50 participants. So this is often for clients with a much broader user base, whereas organizations that have smaller project teams have a much more kind of concise scope of individuals and departments or user types, user groups that need to be engaged with. that's where we can really get into those conversations at a much smaller scale. So in terms of some of the sources that we use to gather these types of data and really be able to kind of weave them together and build a really robust point of view is starting with the quantitative. So this is really where analytics primarily lies. There are a few more qualitative leaning types of data, but for the most part, we're really using this as a source of that kind of numeric, ideally statistically significant data, but we're also looking at things like multiple choice surveys. So again, we'll look at that a little bit more in a moment, but this is really where at a scale, we want to be able to really easily export that data and give people a really easy and quick means of engaging with our kind of input methods. And then we also, of course, use third-party studies. So we'll look at things like census data, but we're happy to kind of build on any research that you have done to date. For qualitative data, this can really be based around interviews, workshops, any kind of open response survey question. So this is really where we're getting more kind of ideas, the feedback, the quality of experience that people are experiencing on the website or what they want to be experiencing. I would say that whenever we kind of start to think about a more concise version of some of the work that we're doing, having a conversation or two can really go a long way. When having access to quantitative data or building that kind of research can be a little bit daunting. So starting with some of the kinds of quantitative data that we use outside of analytics, we typically start projects, particularly ones that are location-based, with just taking a quick look at census data, particularly through Deloitte's tool, datausa.io. So this really can give us a good sense of, for example, with this instance, which is a city in California that we were working with called Oxnard. For them, we really got a sense for what industry shaped both the area's history and population, and we're able to kind of start the project with a sense of what the area is like, as well as getting a sense for kind of the language and cultural diversity in the area. So for us, that really informed our focus on iconography and visual cues later in the design. Another primary source of data collection that we utilize is survey data. So as mentioned a couple slides ago, when surveying over 50 people, we typically utilize multiple choice questions. And this both increases engagement, so making it really easy for people to quickly fill out surveys. We typically aim for under 5 minutes, ideally around 3, especially at some of these larger scales where we're surveying over 1,000 people or so. So one of the main questions that we typically ask, which you can see in the upper right, and is an excerpt from our work recently with the Environmental Defense Fund's employee intranet. So for this, we were really asking what users typically use, like either in terms of their use frequency or how high of a priority they would rate different elements. This could be different tools on your website or different types of content. So from the survey data, as you can see in the bottom right, we're able to really start using this to get a sense for what proportions of users were power users and highly engaged with a really broad set of tools on the website, and what content is engaged with by less frequently by different user types, but again, has some of that high priority. So today we'll be looking at primarily kind of the Google Analytics family, both kind of the new generation as well as kind of previous versions. Again, we're really focused on the types of data. So we'll talk a little bit about how that is changing, but in general, we want to make sure that you have a sense for the types of questions that you can answer through analytics, and what types of topics typically are found across most analytics tools. They're the types of measurements that can really be done using tag management and anything like that. But we are going to talk a little bit about a couple instances where other tools do have specific strengths in how they kind of format that data, and how we kind of typically use that in conjunction with kind of the core Google Analytics package. So again, we'll see kind of Google Analytics and Clarity by Microsoft are both free tools that we will be diving into a little bit today. So again, just to give you a sense of what you can learn and kind of what we really find is really beneficial with the types of organizations that we work with. So website user analytics really doesn't have to be this vague, overwhelming tool that requires complex data analytics. it can often feel like this very overwhelming topic that can be really challenging for users. But in general, once you start poking around, it's really not as overwhelming as you would think. So everything that we're going to look at, all the types of information we're about to review is information that you can find yourself, most likely in your analytics, without creating complex dashboards or reports. We want to make sure that you have a sense for what to look for. So again, this is going to be the description of that data type, the way that it's visualized. It might be phrased a little bit differently across tools, but again, we're here to talk about the types of information. So let's start kind of with the major, one of the biggest topics that we typically cover, which is the number of users for the site. So again, we're really just going to be looking at types of information. A lot of this data that you're going to see is pretty small on the screen. We want to really make sure that it's clear how you can find the kind of information. And again, this is always going to, these different types of tools are constantly going to be evolving. So we want to give you the kind of approach and the methodology which we use. But in general, we typically go in and look at the user count, the total number of sessions, get a sense for how many users are visiting versus returning. So within each of these kind of labels on the bottom left, you'll see the different means of accessing this information through Google Analytics. Again, this is going to evolve a little bit over time, and the visualizations might look a little bit different, but the type of information is still being tracked and organized slightly differently. So one of the big differences that Google is looking to achieve through the next round of kind of their Google Analytics, and I did just see that somebody's hand raised. Just as a note, we will have a full Q&A session at the end, so are really excited to answer those questions a little later on. So yeah, GA4 is really focused on, one, making sure that they can track users across different platforms. So if somebody is starting their journey on a mobile format and moves onto a desktop, that they have the ability to kind of bridge that data. But so that will be something that I think is a little bit more reliable potentially in terms of who your visiting versus returning users are, and making sure that you have a good sense for who they might be. But in general, things like either session averages, so both if they're returning to the site, if they're the amount of time they're typically spending on pages, the bounce rate. I think all of these things are ways to kind of access this information is typically very easily available once you first arrive in your analytics. But in general, I would say that across the board, every form of data that you're going to see within analytics has some sort of bias. So for bounce rates, somebody could be leaving a page or leaving a site because they're successful and they found the information they were looking for. It could also be the exact opposite, and they could be so frustrated that they decide to leave. Similarly, for duration, people could be on a page and really showing a long duration on a page because they're really engaged and they're reading this content in really great depth. And again, it could be the opposite. They could have walked away and there's no way for us to know. So we really want to think about what of this type of data we feel has some level of reliability, and where there is opportunities for a lot of bias or a lot of kind of variation in what you might be seeing. So again, I think the total user count, and now increasingly kind of the number of returning users, can be a slightly more reliable, in my opinion, form of data that you can find. I think another really big benefit of analytics is understanding how users get to their site or to your site. So typically device use, so understanding whether a site is primarily used on desktop or on mobile is one of the biggest types of data that I typically jump straight onto when starting a project. I find that really gives us a good sense for how people are accessing the information and what will be really important to support in either a mobile or stationary journey. We also occasionally look at the browser use. So particularly if we come across an RFP that is really calling out a specific browser, I think it's a good idea to get in there and make sure that going through the effort of really supporting a specific type of access. If that is something that your users are using, we want to make sure that that's something that is supported. But otherwise, we do want to make sure that we're going to be kind of focusing our energy and our development hours in the best way possible. Often, I think one of the big benefits is method of arrival is also a great tool. Again, this is going to be something that there's different ways of looking at, but in general, kind of the acquisition can be really beneficial to understand, at least within a website context or in a digital context in general, how do people get to your site? So there's a couple of different ways of kind of cutting this data or segmenting it. And typically you can find different ways of kind of paging through these different tools. But in general, the kind of primary sources that we use are, one, the overall traffic channel. So whether somebody is coming directly to your site, if they're coming through Google, if they're coming from another site, and if they're being referred by another site, then we start to dig into a little bit more of which website is kind of creating that reference. So making sure that we understand if, for example, you're running a specific marketing campaign, really being able to track that data more easily and kind of see where users are being directed to your site. So from there, kind of understanding who are your users. This is, again, something that is growing with the Google kind of analytics package, but in general, again, I think this is something where there's so many forms of data bias that can potentially be found in here, but it can be a good starting point to build on any information that you have in-house, either through your marketing data or any other kind of measurement tools that you might have. Census data, again, can be a great place to have a little bit more reliability in the data here. But in general, there is the opportunity to start looking at the demographics for any of your users that allow kind of their data to be shared in that way. So this could potentially give you a little bit of a sense, specifically of age, as you'll see in that kind of bottom left chart. You will see gender breakdown, but we typically recommend to clients to kind of, there's not going to be a gender specific content for the most part, unless you're in a specific topic like gender rights or reproductive health or some kind of topic that is related to gender. For the most part, we don't find that that is something that we need to really dig into. However, I think the location can be really beneficial. So at the moment, what you're seeing is kind of the global view. This is, again, in a couple different ways, depending on which form of Google Analytics or which platform you might be in. But this can be configured pretty easily at a global level. You can do different views depending on if you want to see this kind of in the list format like you're seeing, or a little bit more geographic. I think this can be really beneficial as well if you configure it for city-based, kind of a city-based tracking. So for example, if you're a university that is trying to understand kind of which cities your marketing is really kind of engaging with, or if there's any gaps in where you want to really make sure that you are having a better connection with users in that area. We find that that is a pretty good way of tracking usage. So the biggest type of information that we really start to get into is the behavior of users on the site and what they're engaged with. As many people kind of have either brought up to me, or is something that I think is common, a lot of analytics is very focused on conversions, on e-commerce at this point. I think supporting the kinds of organizations that we work with, this kind of behavior is typically what we find the most benefit in, and where we find the most value, kind of build on the build a more data informed approach around content using these tools specifically. So this is often something that you can get into really quickly, either in the overview or going into the behavior engagement. So this is typically, you'll see often kind of the backslash is that first option showing kind of everybody arriving at your homepage. But in general, this can be really helpful in terms of segmenting both kind of the page views, the duration, if any of them have a really high bounce rate or a loading time. Getting into the weeds can be beneficial, but in general, we tend to have kind of a high level snapshot of what is the most commonly frequented content on your site. There's also going to be a couple different ways depending on how you engage with the content itself and the results, in order to start digging in a little bit more into the categories. I would recommend, there's other ways of doing it in the new version, but this is something that, for example, you can really start digging into events or articles or things like that. So how do they browse these pages? So this is something that is not native to Google Analytics, but we typically would use something like Microsoft Clarity or a product called Crazy Egg. Microsoft Clarity is a pretty new tool. It is free. We'll see kind of a preview of some work we're going to look at a little bit more in depth later. But for here, we could see kind of how heat maps of how people are engaging with content. This can really give you a good sense for some of the buttons that are the most frequently clicked. That can also be something where occasionally, and depending on how it's broken down, you can also see which parts of the screen people are kind of pausing on, spending a little bit more time as they scroll through. However, I think this is a little bit more qualitative, so it's typically something that helps us get a sense for how people are working with the data, but we typically rely a little bit more heavily on those quantitative data sets when we're building analytics into our overall content planning. The one thing that I would say about heat maps is they are a little bit challenging in terms of dynamic content. So anytime that you're seeing content that is kind of flipping through, articles, anything that updates, the heat maps can get a little hazy. So that's where it gets a little challenging to really understand how people are engaging with content. So understanding how people move around the site, this is something that is changing quite a bit with the new generation of Google Analytics. So in the past, it's been pretty easy to see things like behavior flow. So this is really giving you a sense of what pages people arrive on the site, where they go from there, and there's third, fourth levels of kind of paths that you can take, but I think it gets a little bit more and more slim in terms of the user traffic, as well as just the visibility, I think, typically. So for me, there's kind of two main paths that people can take to really understand this information in the new version. So as you're seeing perfectly labeled on the bottom is number 2, number 1. And that's going to be your manual way of setting this up. So we can do kind of set up within the exploration tab different templates that either have this funnel exploration in which you're determining a set path that you want to understand how people are, how many people are kind of getting to those success metrics. So often kind of the example that's used for this is somebody getting to a product, putting it in their cart, actually going through the full checkout process. But for us, again, we work with a very different type of organization. So for us, that might be getting to the point of filling out a form or downloading a different type of resource. So again, that's something that you can manually set up if you have those measurements in mind. But otherwise, kind of the path exploration is something that you can implement and will be more open-ended. However, for me, the most beneficial way of using this kind of behavior flow tool is is understanding those landing pages. So really getting a sense for how do people get to your site. From there are going to be so many different paths depending on the users, but having a good sense for what is the reason that somebody that people were brought to the site, depending on where they landed, can really give us a good sense. So that's something that within the engagement, kind of really understanding the different kind of landing pages can be one way of finding some of that information without necessarily going in and setting up a manual report. Another tool that, just to mention, is Matimo. I think does have a very strong version of this. This is something that we have used on behalf of a client who had this installed. So they do have a slightly more clear kind of drill down of what pages lead into specific content, how much of it is coming directly, how much of it is coming from within the site, how much of it is an organic search, and then from there, where people are going. So the one thing to note, just to talk through kind of what you would be seeing in those two bottom charts on the right. So for this was really helping us understand kind of even at a color basis. So what you can see with those kind of blue lines that are coming out on the bottom right of each of those charts is the amount of traffic that's being directed offsite. So for this helped us to understand where key pages were either directing people back into the content and helping them kind of navigate to the type of information they might have been seeking out. In this case, it was kind of housing information and resources for subsidized housing, whereas there's other tools or other types of content that are directing people off the site, which is often not a big driver for our clients. And we want to make sure that we keep people engaged with what we're putting out there. So that is, again, a paid tool, but I think that is one of the benefits as this kind of behavior flow natively gets aged out with Google Analytics. So one of the biggest things is going to be understanding how users interact with KPIs. So this is a little bit, again, more manual most often. It's something that can be configured in conjunction with Google Tag Manager. But in general, this is where you can start to set up those kind of key measurements for success, and that's going to change depending on your organization and the types of interactions. As you can see kind of very briefly from the way that we have it set up on Insight, it's often kind of reader engagement. So it's measured by people getting to the end of a blog post or signing up, going through the full process of filling in a form. So there's different ways that those kind of measurements can be set up. But natively, it'll really focus more on the interactions around kind of events as Google defines them, which is more based around kind of user engagement and things like that. So again, that's going to be a little bit different, and often the way that you drill down into that can change across different tools. But I would encourage you all to kind of go in and click around on some of those kind of events, and that could really give you a sense of where there's more detail kind of to drill down into. So for example, around file downloads or anything like that. And conversions as well, very similar, do need to be manually configured, is not something that we often find kind of natively set up on our clients' analytics. So now we're going to get to kind of some of the big gaps and what you can't learn from analytics. The biggest thing, kind of going back to that qualitative versus quantitative thing, is why are users doing what they're doing? So there are just so many questions that you cannot find from just kind of understanding what page somebody clicked on. We don't know if they're doing what they wish they were doing, if they're frustrated. So there's no way to really bridge using analytics, how kind of the content and the data that you see in a vacuum, understanding if that is what people want to be seeing or want to be engaging with. We also want to understand, were they successful in what they set out to do? Again, that goes back to, did they bounce off your website because they were frustrated or because they found the information they were looking for? We really have no way to know. And there's no way to really determine if that aligns with your organization's measurement of success. So really making sure that the way that the website and content is structured kind of supports both of those, and that your definition of success can start to really be in alignment. We also don't understand or don't know how they interpreted the content that you put in front of them. So there's often disconnects, especially as you get into some of these more diverse in terms of language user bases. Often there's cultural context around the phrasing, the use of iconography. Really, so much of the content can be misinterpreted for so many different reasons. And then there's also the on and or offline context that brought them to the website. So by online, we mean that kind of direct traffic, the Google results, everything like that. But there's always going to be kind of a, for most of the organizations we work with, there is an in-person element. So there might be somebody who's passing them on to information, or somebody who they're looking for a specific type of service or resource. And we really want to understand kind of how to encourage a website experience that aligns with that in-person experience as well. And then above all, did they enjoy their experience? Are they going to come back and tell others about it? Did they find the content impactful in the way that you wanted them to? But overall, one of the biggest things that we want to make sure resonates with you all is that it's important to remember that user analytics isn't just about numbers. These are real people with unique context, goals, and experiences with your website. So I think at a high scale, at a bird's eye view, at a large scale, it's really easy to start to want to kind of package some of these decisions and user experiences into a very data contained environment. But we really want to make sure that this is something that has a very human element to it. So how do we make sure that we keep real people at the heart of our analytics analysis? Talk to them. It's going to be, it sounds intuitive, but it's often one of the biggest challenges that we face through our strategy process is the active engaging and the value of really bringing real users to the table and allowing them to talk to their experiences. And when we say talk to them, we might mean a end user themselves. That might be a senior citizen who's using your library services. It might be a coordinator. So it might be somebody who is answering kind of guest service calls constantly and knows what is the information that people are looking for and can't find on your website right now. So let's go through some of the benefits of engaging directly with users. So one, it establishes that context that we've kind of mentioned is missing around the data. So why are users engaging with certain pages or content? What are the reasons that users come to the site, and are they successful or frustrated? And what parts of the experience do they enjoy and why? Or where would they evolve that experience? This is really where you can identify gaps in existing content and audience segments. So what audiences are you not connecting with and want to? What do existing users want to do on the site that are unable to? And how has your organization outgrown the existing site? So often when we are kind of starting a process of a website redesign, we do want to kind of identify not ways to simply take the existing content and reshuffle it, maybe what we call reskin it, but to really think about where are there gaps, where are there redundancies, where can we make this, if you're going to invest in a new website, how do we make sure that it's not simply a kind of Frankenstein version of the previous version, but is filling needs that aren't there? And I think one of the biggest benefits is that this identifies blind spots prior to investing in design and build. So what do your users think is important, and how does that compare to both your project team as well as any kind of cross-department stakeholder priorities? And is the way that you categorize and label content clear to the audiences you want to connect with? So often there are so many different ways of, again, those kind of cultural contexts of how people interpret some of the content, how your internal organizational language might not be as clear to people outside of your organization. This is where, again, identifying those blind spots prior to the full investment in terms of hours, it's very minimal in terms of kind of the relational hours and investment to have that kind of engagement with users. If you look at, there's often kind of questions around rules of thumb for different kinds of participant pools, who to survey, who to engage with. Often when you look at some of these kind of qualitative research methods, while there is no kind of universal rule of thumb, often these qualitative engagements, the rule of thumb is just remarkably lower than with these kind of quantitative engagements. So often for me, kind of the 5 to 20 person engagement can really answer kind of a wide variety of topics, opportunities for a project, and can really, whereas for quantitative analysis, you really need a much bigger participant pool in order to start taking any kind of statistical significance from the data. And again, so this is where, let's dive into a little bit of a case study of how even talking to just a couple people can make such a big difference. So we're going to look at a little case study around with a museum that we did recently with a usability study. And so for this group, we were interviewing 8 total participants. So again, this is a very small participant pool. We were talking to 4 who represented the museum's user base and 4 who were anonymously recruited through usertesting.com, which is a tool that the client was using. So we were having each of these participants go through and kind of test some of the different ways that we were categorizing information and ensuring that they could kind of find the type, go through a couple scenarios of why people might come to the site, and just testing how successful they thought they were able to use the different filters and facets that we put in front of them. So for each, we had them kind of rate, we had an aggregated difficulty scoring, which we put together, which analyzed users' perceived difficulty in kind of the light gray, the failure rate as we determined by ahead of time and really got a sense for what we wanted users to do and interact with, and then the total number of interactions. So how many times they were clicking around, kind of confused, interacting with content, but not really finding themselves in the right spot. And one of our biggest findings was that the participants who represented the museum's user base were largely unaware of their lack of success in filtering information related to memberships. So what that means is that for those people who were artists in residence, glass collectors, glass scholars, their perception of the content, which had been measured by the team in a vacuum, where they were really going in and testing this language and trying to get a large quantitative data set to inform how people would kind of associate different terms. But when used in a context and when having these conversations with people, this is a group that thought that they did fantastically in finding kind of membership information. But when we went back and kind of measured whether they used the filter, which we had identified as the way that we wanted people to access membership information, that user group was 100% success or failure rate. So none of them were successful in using the filter that had been studied in a vacuum. We really wanted to ensure that there was this access to their main funding vehicle for the museum was something that talking to those 4 people completely reset the client's kind of perspective on how people understood the information they were putting in front of their users. So in terms of what we would recommend, we're going to go through a little bit more of a robust case study for how we would kind of use analytics to bolster an overall kind of user experience. So we're going to talk about some of the recent work that we're doing with Tampa International Airport, or TPA, not TIA. So again, looking at some of the engagements that we've done with them. So on the quantitative side, we have done a pretty robust kind of analytics analysis, as well as a user survey that we'll dig into a little bit more, as well as on the qualitative side. So working both with stakeholders and users in a series of workshops, as well as kind of engaging a under 50, but over 15, over 20 stakeholder survey. So getting a little bit of a sense from across the organization, speaking to executives. So getting the point of view from their executive vice presidents, their CEO, on what was important to communicate about them as an organization, and then kind of going through a series of work sessions with their team. For our quantitative research, so we were working with a user analytics pool from the past year, which was a little bit over 1.5 million visitors. For our survey, we were surveying a little over 1,200 people. The large majority of those are passengers, of course. And then for the stakeholder group, we heard from about 15 different departments across with 26 people. I'm looking at the workshops. So this is where we were really looking at the data that we were pulling and starting to go through some of the needs that were high in terms of the content traffic and what people were engaging with and prioritizing as an internal group. And then we laid out a series of scenarios with both users and stakeholders in which we took them through a few of the different variables in the user journey and understood on a step-by-step basis, where were some of the biggest pain points that users were having, where were their questions that they were not being able to answer on the website, and any other kind of idea or kind of feedback that any department, any user thought was important to put in front of our group. So you'll see kind of in these images, both our guest services kind of folks, our parking and procurement, and just really a very broad range of perspectives. We have users that we had recruited through our survey work, as well as really getting a very cohesive form of input in terms of taking that qualitative feedback that you can see kind of on Post-its on these different scenarios, and then having them vote. So really kind of building this qualitative feedback into a quantitative data mechanism. So our overall goal for this project was to improve alignment between the website, the airport's web experience, and they have a notoriously user-centric in-person journey that we wanted to support. But we also wanted to do that through a lens that incorporated revenue-generating tools like parking booking and food ordering, and telling the story of the impact of the airport on the region. So typically, we kind of build both with the project team as well as with our survey data and input, kind of both a breadth of users, so understanding across different user groups, so from a guest, which is how they refer to their passengers and travelers, sub-needs within those that might determine distinct use types that would bring somebody to the website. So for example, if they're looking for specifically kind of accessibility information, or if they're dropping somebody off and want to understand kind of what that visitor experience is like. We're also looking again at some of those sub-needs within their business audiences, their community audiences, and any of their kind of internal user groups. So for our methodology to pull together this different information, we really wanted to give them a sense for how we were approaching this, both in terms of combining the breadth of data inputs that we gathered through our qualitative and quantitative research mechanisms. So the voting, those stickers you just saw a couple images ago, content traffic. So really giving them a sense for, again, what the analytics shows or kind of supports from what we've been hearing in terms of the breadth, and survey ratings, and then the core team's input. So we'll kind of see on the next slide some of those kind of categories that were scored, the takeaways, and how that really broke down in terms of kind of cross-group elevation of priorities. But we really wanted to make sure to the client and to this group that the scoring represented the methodology that we approach. So again, each form of data is going to have its own form of bias that we do try to balance out by having a lot of different data sources. So again, this is where using your analytics to kind of bolster decision making, but potentially using it in combination with other tools is really beneficial in both having a data-driven approach, but really kind of understanding those gaps. But just making it clear that, again, with this quantitative kind of analysis, there's always going to be a qualitative way of taking that content and not just taking it at face value, but really making sure that we have qualitative input. So again, kind of looking at this aggregated methodology that we've used for this project. So we created a scoring system which combined website analytics. So we have for points every 10,000 page views within the past 12 months was kind of combined into this. So again, everybody who's looking to find and book parking, this was something that was a high priority internally, but we were also able to look at their analytics and show that over 26,000 people went in and used that. We heard from our users in the workshops, kind of the benefit of that. And then we had some of that input from the user survey. So again, we're really kind of balancing these different point values, showing kind of the workshop voting in which we had context. We were there to talk to people about why they were voting on specific topics and not just getting this information in a vacuum, and really starting to balance some of these different perspectives in order to have a more cohesive understanding of their content. So again, for this, we were really looking at kind of the breadth of content, how some of these categories are really high priority or some were lower. So we kind of talked to them about how, again, this really notoriously user-centric experience in person very rarely needed kind of website support. So while that was something that they personally kind of engaged with on a day-to-day basis, that all these things are things that almost every user in the in-person who is having an in-person experience at the airport engages with, they're typically not relying on the website to go to. They're following kind of wayfinding signage and not necessarily reaching out and trying to figure out where the baggage claim is. They're just getting off their flight and going and finding it. However, things like information and updates, that, well, again, that's not a huge priority to the team in terms of how it generates revenue, how it kind of aligns with the user experience. This did, within our methodology, kind of appeal to the broadest range of user groups. So while some of the passengers might be looking for information about the airport in terms of accessibility information, again, to use that example, while where some of the more kind of business-focused audiences might be interested in learning about the leadership or financial reports or anything along those lines. So we're really looking at kind of breadth of needs, as well as kind of how to use that data to both support the decision making, but acknowledging where there are kind of misalignments in what the kind of team's desires are. And so that's where we really start to kind of package this perspective through the lens of different personas. So for example, we're looking at one that really talks to what the experience is like for a 3-generation family to book wheelchair assistance ahead of time, what it's like to drop off your family in park, and knowing what it's like to kind of what to expect, and getting that expectation really set before you get to the airport of what you're going to be able to get in terms of mobility assistance. And this is where talking to people and really understanding how vulnerable it is to leave your parent with somebody at a gate in a wheelchair and go park your car. Those are the kinds of things that you cannot see in your analytics, but really, again, seeing the access to the accessibility page is a huge driver in terms of how we support this person's need and the kind of experience that they're looking for through the analytics and kind of bolstering that decision making. So again, we're looking at some of the motivators, some of that kind of qualitative and quantitative voting that we had around brand qualities to talk about one of those motivators are things like clarity, reliability, and trust. And then talking through kind of, again, where those really big opportunities are in their airport journey, and where we really want to make sure that we kind of support the different needs And again, these are all kind of capturing different types of content that we saw a couple slides ago in those charts. So we really want to make sure that we use the analytics to support this very human experience and really create this very seamless experience that we understand kind of what is most engaged, but do it in a way that really connects with people on an individual basis.